We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make CapTime's Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Epic. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Hello again, everybody. I just want to say one more time how I so much appreciate your being here in person. It just means a huge amount to me and everyone at the Capital Times. I've been anticipating this session since midsummer. Our title is The Fracturing of America. This summer I was intrigued by an article in the Atlantic magazine and sought to interview its author, George Packer, for my column. The article outlined his thesis that our nation has splintered politically into four discernible parts: Smart America, Just America, Real America, and Free America. George will explain. I then read his new book, from which the magazine piece was adapted, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal, and I was hooked on his analysis. George has written extensively for The New Yorker and The Atlantic, often about foreign policy. His books include The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, which was hugely acclaimed. Publishers Weekly said this about the book: "The Iraq debate has long needed someone who is both tough-minded enough and sufficiently sensitive to register all its complexities. In George Packer's work, this need is answered." On his For America thesis, I heard George interviewed by Milwaukee-based commentator Charles Sykes on Charlie's popular national broadcast, The Bulwark. Charlie is editor-at-large for The Bulwark, founded it in 2018. Its website describes it as providing political analysis and reporting free from the constraints of partisan loyalties and tribal prejudices. Though as a regular listener, a consistent theme is his and its disdain for Trumpism. Charlie has written 9 books, including 2017's How the Right Has Lost Its Mind, and also is a regular contributor on NBC and MSNBC, and he's appeared at Idea Fest twice before. George told me when we talked for my column that he'd like to visit Wisconsin, in part because our state has become a crucial battleground and sort of the epicenter of a lot of the hyper-partisanship going on in the country. Charlie, of course, knows all about that, and I suspect how George's For Americas might also refer to the political splintering of Wisconsin. So would you welcome George Packer and Charlie Sykes to our stage? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you all coming today. If I'd known I had to wear a mask, I wouldn't have shaved this morning. But George and I have actually had this conversation before on my podcast back in June, when things seemed more optimistic, right, John? I mean, things felt they were getting a little bit better. Have you changed your view on the last best hope and the prospects for fixing things since June?
Yes, so we've had the Delta variant. We've had the collapse of Afghanistan and a shambolic evacuation. We've had the return of masks and more national nervous breakdowns over vaccines. And in a way, that was probably an illusory little interval back in the spring and early summer, because we're still in the same trajectory we've been in for a long time. And it's not something we're going to suddenly pull ourselves out of all at once. But I wrote Last Best Hope in the middle of a truly, literally dreadful time between October and January of last year, when we had both the pandemic and the economic collapse, the threat of civil violence with the election that seemed very real and was finally experienced on January 6th, which was in some ways the last day of 2020, that horrible year. And yet, in writing the book, I wrote myself into a state of some hopefulness that we do still have some attachment to one another and to our democracy. It's very frayed. It's very fragile. Another election could be enough to blow it all apart. But this past election was actually, in some ways, an encouraging experience, and so has some of the politics and policies of the early Biden months. So what are we going to do? I mean, we live here. We're stuck with each other. We're stuck with this country. You give up hope, and then what?
Yeah, we are stuck with one another. So when I first read the book, and I told you this back in June, I found it very, very challenging. It's a great read, but it's challenging and I think a lot of readers are going to find it challenging across the intellectual spectrum, because as I told you, I would put the book down every once in a while and go, oof, okay, he's describing me, what I used to think, what actually the reality was. And I think that during the podcast, I described the book, and see whether you still agree with it. This is not a safe space for people across the political spectrum. I mean, I consider myself center-right, you consider yourself center-left, correct? But I think that you challenge people across the political spectrum in a way that I described as merciless and you described as empathetic, right?
You know, sometimes mercilessness is a form of empathy.
Yeah.
There is something to offend everyone in the book. It's true. Because I've tried to take a hard look at the last few decades. I think of the period from the 70s to the present as a kind of distinct era, just as the period from the Depression to the 70s was the Roosevelt era. And this era has been marked by two big trends. One is the rise of what I call a multi-everything society and democracy, with immigration from all over the world, with black people becoming, in some ways, first-class citizens, although in many other ways remaining second-class, but at least in civil rights and political rights, and in some ways in influence in culture and politics, coming to the table. Women's rights, creating greater equality for women. In other words, and then in gender and sexuality, all kinds of identities, finally having a voice, not always enough of a voice, but finally having a voice, and the complexion of the country becoming more fluid and mixed than it's ever been, literally. And the second trend is the end of the industrial age and the rise of the information economy, which has created winners and losers on a scale we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, and which has stratified our economy beyond anything that I experienced earlier in my life, so that we're back to the age of robber barons and the Gilded Age. So those two things, more pluralism, more diversity, more inclusion, and more inequality, more stratification, those two things together have created a lot of conflict and friction, and in the end resulted in these four narratives that I talk about in the book.
We're going to circle back on that, because it does come down to your discussion of inequality and the rapid acceleration of inequality and the challenges that poses for self-government. So you talk about the four Americas, and you make it clear this is not an ethnographic description. These are four major intellectual trends, the free America, the just America, the smart America, the real America.
Yeah.
By the way, welcome to Madison, Wisconsin, which is not the real America. I think you probably figured that out.
Right.
So,
but if you drive 10 miles outside Madison...
Exactly. You can't get there from here.
Right.
So I was actually trying to think about what Wisconsin would be. Would Madison be just America, smart America? Would rural Wisconsin, clearly real America? Would Waukesha, Wisconsin be, what would that be? That would be free America?
You have it all here. That's why people
Right.
come to Wisconsin. That's why you have won outsized attention from the rest of the country, because whatever happens here is going to be what happens in the rest of the country.
So let's talk about the first one
Yeah.
before we open up to questions, which I suspect there will be many. Let's talk about the free America, that tradition which seems so deeply embedded in our political traditions and our culture, our intellectual tradition. What do you mean when you describe free America? And as I told you before, this was a little painful for me to read because there was a time when I would have said this was a description of where I came from. So,
Right. Free America, there's a chronology here, a sequence. So there's a reason why in the book I start with Free America and then Smart America and then Real America and then Just America. Free and Smart America are both more elite narratives. They have taken root in people who are more in the successful parts of our society. Free America, it was Reagan's America. It was the shining city on the hill. It was, Jane Mayer was talking about it earlier, it rose up in the 70s with a very powerful current of thinking on the right and in business that government was the problem, that the less government, the better, that the more free the market, the better for everyone, because government could only reduce the pie and get things wrong. And if you set business free and set individuals free, they would find a way to create broader prosperity for all. And that, I would say, that is the most influential of the four narratives in my adult life. It set the terms of political thought and debate for decades on both the right and the left. The Democratic Party was just as affected by it as the Republican Party. Eventually, it became the orthodoxy of the Republican Party. And today, you can still hear, if you listen to Senate speeches or if you go on the website of conservative foundations and think tanks, it's the same thing you've been hearing for 40 years. Cut taxes, deregulation, small government, and free trade. So it's become a kind of cargo cult, repeated endlessly when data is often at odds with it. For example, tax cuts don't create jobs in the last few decades. We've seen job creation at a higher rate when taxes have gone up on wealthy Americans, for example, in the 1990s. So it was a promise made extremely attractive in the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan. It had a huge influence, but I would say it failed because it did not create broad prosperity. Instead, it created a lot of inequality with Wall Street and some corporations and Silicon Valley doing extremely well, and whole parts of the country, blue-collar areas, rural areas, industrial areas, allowed to sort of slowly wither away without any government intervention to prevent or to rescue. And so it has led to a kind of disillusionment, which we'll get to. Each of these narratives has produced a reaction, a rebellion from people who might have held. The word freedom is still a key word.
And will remain one.
And will remain, but it's changed its meaning. And we'll get to that.
You know, when we talked last time, I read you this paragraph, which was one of those paragraphs that I read in the book when I described it as challenging, where I had to sit down and sort of go, oof, okay, because I recognize the attraction of this, but then what your critique is. And this is what you wrote. You were talking about Ronald Reagan, talking about freedom as the shining city on the hill. The shining city on the hill was supposed to replace remote big government with a community of energetic and compassionate citizens, all engaged in a project of national renewal. But nothing held the city together. It was hollow at the center, a collection of individuals all wanting more. Free America measured civic health by gross domestic product. It saw Americans as entrepreneurs, employees, investors, taxpayers, and consumers, everything but citizens. That's a gut punch, and that's really the sort of the
with Reagan, there was a promise that we would be a great community. The city was supposed to be a place where everyone was engaged together in something. But the way it was played out in politics and in policy, it atomized us. Everyone was out for themselves, and the idea of owing something to each other was lost. And so I think it began to tear apart the social fabric.
Because in the conservative tradition, the long conservative tradition, there was always a sense of the common good. There was always a sense of ordered liberty. And as you describe it, that begins to break up, through Reagan and Gingrich, where everybody for themselves, where it was, much less focused on getting things done as a national purpose.
And I think it's because it was informed by an idea, which is libertarianism. And libertarianism does not have an idea of society. It has an idea of the individual as a free agent, and society can only get in the way of that freedom. So because it really came out of a set of intellectual projects, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and those were and others who were the writers who really influenced the people around Reagan and the early years of Reagan, because it had that abstraction, it lost sight of the way people were actually living, which is to say communities, not entirely because of this, but because of globalization and technology and social change, communities were dissolving during those years. And that was totally at odds with Reagan's rhetoric, and it took a long time for that dissonance to become obvious.
Okay, that's the first America, free America. Smart America, which I think people are going to immediately recognize as the meritocratic America, right? The highly educated America, the Democratic Party embracing that. So talk to me about smart America and where, and where it went wrong.
Well, in each case, I want to give these narratives their due. And the words I've used for them, free, smart, real, just, are not put downs. They're the value that these narratives think that they're pursuing. Smart America is the America, as you say, Charlie, of educated professionals. And it became, in the 90s, the heart of the Democratic Party, which was a shift. This was the party of the working class throughout most of the 20th century. And in the 90s, partly because of social change, the decline of unions, and also the pressure coming from free America to critique and to sort of see government really as something that had to be kept to pretty strict limits. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton I think of as classic smart Americans. Barack Obama is another. They came out of the Ivy Leagues and out of the meritocratic educational system where your talents are rewarded, are recognized through tests, and then are rewarded with admission to top colleges and then to top professions. That's the path of smart America. And what it has to say to the working class is basically get an education. You may feel as if you are being left behind. Education is a good thing. Get an education. We'll retrain you. We'll make sure your children have more opportunity. We'll open up the elite universities to more people. That was the promise of the meritocracy. It didn't really work out that way because, in fact, what we now know is people are born meritocrats more than they are made meritocrats. Our society has become so rigidly tracked, and success is so wedded to where you're born and who you know and what kind of world you were raised in, who your parents are, what kind of work they do.
You have an interesting observation that today it is a low-income child it's as hard for them to get into an Ivy League college as it was in the 1950s.
Yes. So after 50-plus years of efforts at making university education more widely available, it's still just as stratified, just as hard to get from the bottom to the top. And in fact, social mobility, which is kind of the marker of whether meritocracy is working, is there a kind of churn with each new generation so that talent keeps rising to the top? And if the next generation doesn't have the talent, then someone replaces them. It doesn't happen really that way. Each generation is now pretty much assured of remaining in place once it gets there. You have to fall a long way. And parents, and this is my world, parents spend inordinate amounts of time on test prep tutors and music lessons and studying the U.S. News and World Report, guide to top American universities and college tours. This is the family business, success. And families put a huge amount of effort into making sure that their children stay in that business. And so in a way, the competition is so intense and the advantages are so one-sided that, that to think that you can actually earn your way into the meritocracy is less and less true.
Well, let's talk about the way this played out, because you write in the book, and I read this to you on the podcast, in April 2000, Bill Clinton hosted a celebration called the White House Conference on the New Economy. Bill Gates is sitting there, all these high-powered folks are there. At one point, Clinton informed the participants that Congress was about to pass a bill for permanent trade relations with China, which would make both countries more prosperous and China more free. I believe the computer and the internet give us a chance to move more people out of poverty more quickly than at any time in all of human history, he exulted. And your next sentence, you can almost date the election of Donald Trump to that moment.
So that deadpan one-liner, because the euphoria of the Clinton years and the sense of we know how to solve these problems. Education is the answer to everything. And accepting change. If you read Thomas Friedman's book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, written at the same time, you felt as though this is a man describing something that is inevitable, and that there's just no two policies about it. You just have to get on board the train or you're going to be left behind. And that kind of both giddiness and I would say a certain amount of condescension and myopia is bound to make people resentful who don't feel part of it and who feel, if anything, that that system is geared against them, that they don't have either the skills or the opportunities to join the White House Conference on the New Economy. They're going to begin to resent and perhaps have a backlash to the notion that that be more like the Clintons and you'll be fine.
So you also write that the winners in Smart America have withdrawn from the national life of their fellow Americans, what Christopher Lasch called the revolt of the elites. Just talk to me about that this separation. It's not economic, social, cultural, in terms of attitudes about the world, race, education, patriotism.
Well, we all sentimentalize our childhood, but if I think back to what I watched on TV, what I ate, what kind of bike I rode, it was, how my parents got the news, it was not that different from the majority of people in the country. Everyone ate tuna noodle casserole. Everyone rode a Schwinn or, a Raleigh. Everyone watched Walter Cronkite. Obviously, the 60s were hugely divisive, but there was a sort of middle-class culture. Time magazine might have been the Bible of the middle-class culture. And in the last few decades, that has become completely untrue. The food we eat now tells you what class we belong to, what kind of education we have. The places we shop, the middle-class stores are gone, so now there's either boutiques or Dollar General. And the erosion of that middle-class culture has come with a literal geographic segregation by both class, so that people marry people from there. Now men no longer marry the secretary, they marry the epidemiologist who they met in grad school. I mean, that's become the way partly the meritocracy replicates.
Marries the economist from Princeton.
Exactly.
And their children.
That's the level of diversity you find in Ivy League marriages. So that just replicates the meritocracy within families, and it separates us more and more so that we don't really know or recognize people who are not on that path. And there's a kind of alienness that Americans feel when they encounter each other, as if you've wandered 10 miles outside Madison into a foreign country.
So speaking of that, I remember a conversation that I had, and I think it was probably late 2015 or 2016, with an elected official from Wisconsin, who I won't name, who had a very interesting insight. He said, you, and he was talking to a group of us, he said, none of you know people who live in Campbellsport, Wisconsin. you don't know how many people in this area, within 30 miles of you, live on $38,000 a year, or what they think about these issues, or the way, how they react to what they know you think about them.
Yes.
And it was interesting because in a lot of ways that was predictive of what was going to happen in our politics. And we're going to get to the real America.
Well, and I think
real America is completely alien. The quote-unquote real America is completely alien. And by the way, the real America, I refer to this as your Sarah Palin chapter, which may be somewhat unfair.
No,
so we can segue into that.
I want to give Sarah Palin credit where it's deserved. She used the phrase "real America" in a stop to a group of donors in North Carolina, and what she said, this was in 2008, she said, "I love coming to these parts of America that I call the real America, where patriotic, hardworking people grow our food and teach our children and fight in our wars." And so she was talking about white, Christian, small town, rural, heartland America. That's the real America. So what is the fake America? You can kind of draw conclusions. It's cities, it's the coasts, it's black people, it's non-Christian people, it's secular liberal elites. And the divisiveness of her conceit has played out ever since in our politics, because, and it's not as though she's the first ever to try to claim this. This is the nature of populism, to be able to say Andrew Jackson, William Jennings Bryan, George Wallace. It's to be able to say, we are the real people. We work with our hands. We are the heart, the backbone of the country. And you, whether it's someone who has darker skin or someone who sits in front of a laptop all day, you are somehow undeserving and even parasitic on our labor, and yet we're not seeing, we're being left behind and cut out of line. And that's, by the way, Kathy Kramer's here. She's done pioneering work on this.
I was just going to mention, and her work, which also preceded the recognition of it all, though it shows that this really did resonate, that people in rural America really do feel that they are looked down upon, that they are not respected, that they are the salt of the earth, and that their values are not represented and not respected. And there's a long, long, long tradition of that. So in your book, you described this particular iteration of this populism as a form of identity politics. Could you talk about that? And how much of that identity politics is tied up in race?
I think with Sarah Palin, when she came on the scene, I had an immediate recognition what people, and I did some reporting. I was in southeastern Ohio and Appalachian Ohio, and people were telling me this. What did they like about her? That she could fit right in at that booth in that diner. She was one of them. She was not from the working class. She was in the working class, and her clothing, her shoes, her vernacular, her children, her sense of humor, and her ignorance, and her lack of professional polish, and her rather mediocre educational credentials, all of this validated her as someone of that identity. So it wasn't her ideas, and it certainly wasn't her expertise. In fact, expertise was considered a liability. It was her identity. What was that identity? It was white working class identity. So it was a kind of white identity politics that I think is new. Of course, white identity has been at the heart of our politics forever, but as a kind of aggrieved, almost like on the way to being another aggrieved minority that needed to assert its identity in order to be heard, because you don't hear me, my voice isn't heard, that felt like something
It's more like
new.
European-style ethno-nationalism like you see in Hungary, which may explain why so many right-wingers are enamored with Hungary.
And this is, Tucker Carlson, for example, and this is where Free America was part of the target of Sarah Palin. She didn't name Ronald Reagan and the Koch brothers as her target, but the mantra of Free America, which was pro-immigration, pro-trade, and anti-safety net, anti-Social Security, anti-Medicare, That was not Sarah Palin's platform. Right. She didn't really have a platform. And it was certainly not the next iteration, Donald Trump's, because you can draw a straight line from Palin to Trump. It was not his platform. So it was something new. It was more like a European, it wasn't the abstract idea that we're all free and should rise as far as we can. It was the feeling of this soil, this blood, this identity, which deserves those benefits. Don't take my benefits away because I deserve them because I'm the backbone of this country. Don't give them to people who don't work, who don't deserve them, but don't take mine away. So in a sense, it was a rejection of some of the orthodoxy of free America and the Republican Party.
So you have an interesting image here of the Republican Party, say, circa 2014, like a funhouse mirror where the head and the body they look like they're attached, but they're completely different directions. So the head is still Reagan orthodoxy, Wall Street orthodoxy. The body is this identity politics. It's a Walmart base, run by people who are still, who are still with the orthodoxy. So where does Donald Trump come into this bifurcated, incoherent Republican Party?
Well, I think he got elected because he acted like the body of the party. He was deeply connected to the feelings, the grievances, the resentments of the base of the party. And no other candidate had articulated them with such rawness and brutality, which only made him seem more authentic and more like I am your voice. You remember he said that at the convention? Powerful line, and I think it resonated because that voice was not the voice of someone who was going to then go into a back room and cut a deal. It sounded like someone who meant it. Turned out he did go into a back room and cut a deal because once he was in power, he had no interest in governing and no ability to govern, and so the head of the party really ran his policy, and the only significant achievement of his term in domestic policy was the tax cut, which was a pure free America idea. So it really didn't look anything like the body that had won the election of 2016.
But as you point out, it's also important to note that in this timeline of what it looked like the ascendancy of smart America, that the elites in America had failed over and over again on one issue after another. Not obviously the most dramatic being the war in Iraq, which was fought by one America, not the other America.
Yes.
And the financial collapse. So,
which was like the war, the losers, the people who bore the brunt of the financial collapse, were the middle and working class. Right. Wall Street did fine. So it seemed like no matter how badly the elites failed, a speed bump, that was what one guy on Wall Street called it to me, no matter how badly the elites failed, they always seemed to do okay. In fact, ever better. And those who had their money in a retirement account and who had a house with a heavy mortgage were the ones who went under. So everything that happened in those years of, let's say, 9/11 up to the election of Trump just seemed to confirm that there was something rigged here, something skewed toward the free and smart America, the corporate class and the educated professional class, and against the real people who were always on the losing end.
Okay, so you asked the question, who was Trump? A fascist, a white nationalist, a malignant narcissist, a conservative with very bad manners? Where do you come down? How do you answer that question?
I resist the fascist analogy. Mm-hmm. Fascism was a modernizing, forward-looking ideology that energized people to commit themselves to great projects for the nation. The projects were horrible. They were war and genocide, but there was a kind of...
They were big things.
They were big things. And if you look at the faces in the rallies of the 30s in Italy and Germany, everyone is transported. They're being exalted higher than themselves, and Hitler and Mussolini give them this feeling of idealism, really. It's a kind of idealism, even though it's a hateful one. Trump's rallies, the faces look like people who have had a good time watching someone run down their enemies and tell some crass jokes. And
I think you described it as Jersey Shore comes to a politics.
yeah, it's like barroom politics. And they go home early. They don't even wait till he's finished because it's boring. And they've had fun. And what are they being called to? Make America great again? Was there ever a breath of inspiration in anything Trump did? It was all lowering people down. So I see him like a classic figure out of American history, a demagogue. And demagogues are natural to our soil because as a democracy, the people believe that they should rule. And when the people feel that an elite has taken over and is ruling in their place and in their name, they're an easy target for a demagogue who can turn them against those elites for his own benefit. So I see him very much as an American type that Mark Twain would have easily recognized.
So let's get to the fourth America. We've done Free America, Smart America,
Real America.
Real America, and now we get to Just America, which you could have called Woke America.
Yeah. If I wanted to put these narratives down or sink them before I'd even begun to look at them, I would have called it Woke America. I would have called Trump's, something like Racist America. But I wanted to frame them as they saw themselves, as these narratives are presented, because people are attracted to something of value, not to something that's denigrated. So justice is the core value of a new generation, which is called the millennials, who came up during this period of disillusionment with the war, with the recession, with debt, with Trump. And they, I think, began to feel that the progressive, optimistic narrative of Smart America, of the Clintons, of Obama, crucially, that even though we're a flawed country and an imperfect country, we're becoming a more perfect union, and it's gradual, but it's inevitable that we will get there. They stopped believing in that.
So this is what you wrote, and when we did the podcast, I said I read this passage to my wife when we discussed it, because it was a little bit startling. You described this new generation. This new generation had little faith in ideas the previous ones were raised on. All men are created equal. Work hard and you can be anything. Knowledge is power. Democracy and capitalism are the best systems, the only system. America is a nation of immigrants. America is the leader of the free world. And what you basically say is this generation rejects all of that.
Or believes it's a lie, believes that
it's a pretty fundamental shift.
Yeah, that history and present reality give the lie to the 4th of July rhetoric that is in that paragraph, and that in fact we don't want to face who we are because we've always been unwilling to look ourselves in the face. But what we really are is a country founded on evil and on the sin of slavery, and that sin has in some ways remained with us forever and may well remain with us forever into the future, that there's something fixed about our history and our character that is not undergoing gradual but inevitable improvement. Instead, a whole raft of scholarship and journalism and cultural work, art, has looked to the past of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, redlining, etc., to understand the present, rather than seeing the present as an evolution from the past. And it's been enormously influential on, especially, I would say, educated younger people who have embraced a new narrative that is in some ways reminiscent of real America. Both of them don't buy the optimistic story. Both of them see America as somehow damaged. And although they see it damaged in different ways and want to take it in different directions, they're both rejecting the kind of patriotic language that I was raised on.
Also rejecting many of the values of small L liberalism. Much of this is, as you write in the book, is profoundly illiberal, intolerant. So let's just talk for a moment, since we have a limited amount of time, about critical race theory, because you talk about that, and I think that we discussed it, and the right wing is exaggerating it, but you do say that the left is in denial about the problem.
I think that, like almost everything in our culture and politics, it has, critical race theory has lost its original meaning and become a kind of distortion that each side uses. Mm-hmm. And as you say, the right has grossly exaggerated its effect in schools, in culture, and is using, in some ways, the wrong term, because it's using a set of intellectual ideas from the 80s and 90s as a way of explaining something that's different, which is actually happening, but it's not that. It's something more like a desire for self-purification or redemption through admission of sin. I see it as almost a religious movement, this aspect of social justice, where people have to confront themselves publicly, be named as sinners, confess the sin, and then, if they're lucky, be absolved of it and redeemed and admitted into the community of the faithful. And that, and on the left, what I see is a denial that that's going on at all. I have kids in the New York schools. I know it's going on. I've written about it. I know it's going on, and it's going on in a lot of places in America, especially, I think, in the more prosperous suburbs like Evanston, Illinois, or the suburbs of Dallas, where a largely white and well-off and sort of progressive-minded community is suddenly seized with the desire to live up to the challenge of last summer's protests, and is doing it in a way that seems to me illiberal and destructive, because rather than seeing these ideas as ideas among many ideas that need to be looked at and discussed, but criticized just like anything else, instead it's become a kind of dogma that's imposed and is intolerant of any critique and of any nuance or complication. And that, to me, is dangerous, because it means that we think we have the answer, and we actually want to shut up the challenges to that. And it reminds me again of real America, of some of the intolerance and illiberalism that you get on the right. And they seem to be sort of rubbing against each other in a way that drives each to the opposite corner.
So if you haven't filled out your card, we only have a few minutes. If you have any questions, please fill it out and send it forward. So this leads to the real obvious question: is how do we get past this? This fracturing of America, the four Americas. They don't talk to one another. They don't comprehend one another. They can't stand one another. They are fearful of one another. How do you get past that?
Well,
what is our last best hope?
Yeah. I wish we had more time. So I'll have to be really reductive here. I think two things. One is, at the bottom of so many of our problems is inequality, the feeling of individuals and groups that they are not equal citizens. And that has been the core to American identity from the beginning, the desire, the demand that I be an equal citizen no matter who I am. Of course, it's been denied and violated in practice, but as a driving force of our society, it's always been there and always will be. So I think what the first thing we need to do is a set of policies that start to reverse the effects of 40 or 50 years of growing and drastic inequality. I see some of what Biden has proposed in his infrastructure bill and elsewhere as actually a promising turn of direction, where for the first time in a long time, government is given a really significant role in trying to bring people who are either poor or are outside the benefits of the information economy to a higher status. Not just higher pay, but higher status. They're given the respect that they feel they've lost without having to become another college-educated engineer. But the other half of it is, and that's a little bit of that is from Tocqueville, and this is also from Tocqueville. We have lost the art of self-government. That's a phrase of his. We cannot solve problems together any longer. The pandemic was a perfect example. Instead, a problem drives us to conflict and to our separate tribes. So we need to reacquire the talents, the habits of the heart, as Tocqueville said, that make us capable of running our own affairs as a people. And I throw out a few ideas that are hardly original at the end of the book, but I think if we just see this as a matter of one side winning, I don't see that as a way out. I mean, I'm torn. On the one hand, we have a genuine assault on democracy going on, and that has to be fought relentlessly. And yet, I don't really want to win, because I think winning seems like it's simply going to leave us divided and with half the country resenting the other half and feeling conquered. And instead, we will never agree about things, but we have to see each other as fellow citizens again. And I think there are ways that can happen, both from leadership, but also at the grassroots.
So what are the elements of the inequality? You mentioned there's the financial, the economic inequality, which is the obvious one, and that probably can be most directly dealt with.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about the real America, and you mentioned Tocqueville, that deep sense of America that everybody is equal and can have a participation, that's not necessarily always about money.
No.
So that's where it becomes more difficult. Is it about respect? Is it about, and again, this is difficult, and let's be honest about it, because there are moments where you go, am I supposed to respect people who
refuse vaccines?
Well, that's what I was going.
And then who refuse to have vaccines imposed. Yeah, I find it very difficult, very hard. And I want to dismiss them as just beyond the pale, beyond the pale. But once you've done that, you haven't solved the problem. You've created more of a problem for yourself. You haven't won.
So you and I had a similar experience, and so you wrote about it in the book, so I'm not telling any tales out of school. You described right before the election, you're driving through the rural community where you'd been living, and drove by the house of one of your neighbors who you'd had a wonderful relationship with. Really good people, right? Salt of the earth people.
Farmers.
And your headlights flash on the fact that they had put up a series of Trump signs.
Yeah.
And you described you were sort of taken aback, your family was taken aback. And the question is, would you address this? Would you talk to them about it? And so,
yeah, and
did you?
I didn't, and I won't, because
okay. So my story is, I was saying that my wife and I were watching some neighbors who had a boat, and they were teaching their children how to water ski, and they were wonderful. We were commenting what a great family they were. And then, in the middle of this conversation, we were saying what wonderful neighbors they were. They unfurled a giant flag right in front of us, stolen election, which is to me the equivalent of a giant middle finger. And you and I had the same reaction, which was, we're not actually going to have a conversation about this, are we? We're not going to go over and talk to them about this.
It's an even worse reaction than that. It's, how can this be connected to that?
Exactly.
These people, I like them, I count on them, they're good neighbors. And yet they're for this really reprehensible, horrible leader. How can that be, and how do I connect them, and then how do I connect myself to them? I knew I would never bring it up, because it could only lead to bad things. There is no way around. So how do we do it? One is by not trying to talk at each other directly about it, because we don't persuade each other. We no longer have that. Another way is maybe trying not to do anything through Twitter. Twitter seems to exist in order for people in Silicon Valley to make a ton of money while the rest of us become our worst selves. Doesn't seem to me like a promising project for democracy. So if we could find ways to bring Americans together, especially young people, from the separate tribes, from the separate parts of the country, not to argue about politics, but to do something, whether it's like a civilian conservation corps, or whether it's Teach for America, or whether some national service projects, serving in the military, and yet making it required, because people otherwise are going to, the elites will find a way not to do it. Then at least we would have the experience of being around each other as human beings and realizing that we are not entirely the caricature we become on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, this is actually one of the most difficult things, because remember in 2017 there were all of these efforts to reach across the divide and how do we talk to one another, and none of those went anywhere, except the ones that said, okay, if we don't talk about politics and we deal with one another at a human level, we can make connections. But that puzzlement, how does this person get to that? Because you want to know, for me, it's the strength. So here's the President of the United States that is praising insurrectionists today. Do my neighbors, who I know are decent, hardworking, church-going Americans, did they buy that? But you know that the conversation would not go well. Okay, so we have one question here, and let me just share it with you, but I want to take a crack at it first, okay?
Yeah.
What role does Russian disinformation play? Fighting the last war, people. It's not the Russian disinformation. The disinformation is coming from inside the house. And to the extent that Russia plays any role whatsoever, they see what we are doing, they watch Fox News, they listen to the former President of the United States, and then they simply amplify it. That's the role of Russian disinformation.
I agree. I think what Putin and his minions did was they saw us before we had seen ourselves. They understood that we were becoming more like them, that we were becoming a country that could, here's another one for you, that could easily be divided, that could be deceived, turned into conspiracy theorists, that could be willing to abandon centuries of democratic norms and values, and they exploited it. But that was us. We had made ourselves a big fat target. Russia, perhaps out of the kind of cleverness that comes from that level of corruption, understood what we were becoming and knew just how to exploit it.
So here's a question. How close are we to a civil war or of a somewhat nonviolent sort or violent sort? I mean, I've been predicting for some time the next MAGA play is secession, but I don't know how serious they're going to be.
Yeah, I mean, last fall, in October, I was asking my wife, should I get a gun? I've never owned a gun. It was totally out of character. She and my kids said, have you lost your mind? No, you're not going to get a gun. But I was genuinely thinking, I don't want to be the only one around here who isn't armed if things come to that. Like, yeah.
So funny you say that.
I did not get a gun, which was the right move. But I don't think we're very far, not from, it's not going to be Civil War scale violence, but from, I mean, look, we saw on January 6th how easy it is if you have the following ingredients: a leader willing to incite it, a large part of the population feeling that it's been so shut out and defrauded that it has no alternative but violence, and a crisis, like an election or a constitutional crisis. If those three things are in place, and we're very close on all three, sure. We're a violent country. There's a lot of guns here.
And the rhetoric about, traitors and who hates America and all of that stuff, that has a consequence at some point.
It's used kind of glibly and casually, but that's how.
Okay. I wish we had more time for this question, because I know you have a lot to say about it, but does the mainstream focus on divisions between Americans become a self-fulfilling prophecy and give people more ideas about why they are different from their neighbors, whereas they are often more similar on big and on big things? So I mean, we're talking about the fact that we're all in this group together, but the discussion emphasizes the divisions. Is that self-fulfilling?
I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that. I mean, look, I don't want to sentimentalize the people. The American people are quite capable of dividing against one another without help, but it's become to the great advantage of both political and media elites to stoke this.
Dopamine
At
hit.
this point, MSNBC has no audience if it doesn't stoke this every night. Fox News has no audience if it doesn't stoke this every night. And half the members of Congress can't get reelected if they don't stoke this. So it's in the interest of our of people in power, but I blame the media for a lot of this, to point to the wounds and to the raw sensibilities and to the injustices, when in fact they might be either exaggerating them or simply ignoring what people have in common, because I still think that we do have things in common. And I have a whole chapter in the book in which I try to describe American character as a set of traits that any foreigner immediately recognizes, whether you're from Madison or northern Wisconsin or New York City or Arizona, but we can't see it because we're so focused on the ways in which we hate each other.
You know, you used a phrase early in our discussion, but talk about the national nervous breakdown. I sometimes think watching cable television that having nervous breakdowns has become a business model. George Packer, thank you so much for all of your time, George. The book is Last Best Hope by George Packer. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make CapTime's Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.